Thank you, Tobias, and good afternoon, friends and neighbors from near and far, for this conversation about the 100 years young Dixwell Community House, a community center in the Dixwell neighborhood of New Haven, near downtown and near the Yale campus, a community center that has been important for our community and, as you will hear, has had national impact. I've known and been part of the Q House since the 1980s, and have been honored to be present at its recent rebirth, along with Chaz and Frank and many others. And I want to salute in particular the women of the Dixwell Q House who kept the faith in recent decades and saw that this organization was resurrected and has a wonderful rebirth in this century. And it's a privilege to share the screen with two of the greatest centurions of Dixwell, New Haven, and Connecticut history, Frank Mitchell and Chaz Warner. We three, along with Tobias, all know the power of living history, the engagement of the past in the present for the future. I'm going to begin with a few notes about the year 1924 in New Haven and the nation and the world, talk a little bit about Black America in the time, the early days of the Q House, controversy and conflict, excellence and achievement, and the national recognition and impact, and then turn it over to Frank to talk about some of the peer organizations of the time and other impacts of the Q House legacy, followed by Chaz. 1924 was a leap year, just like 2024, and of course, an elections year and an Olympics year. It was the year, among other things, that the brilliant James Baldwin was born. It was an auspicious year. New Haven's population in 1924 was near its all-time peak. There were, in that time, in the 1920 census, 162,000 plus people in New Haven, up from 133,000 just 10 years before, and from 108,000 in 1900. New Haven at the time was by far the most populous city in Connecticut, and it was in fact the 39th most populous city in the country. The Black population was about 8,000, about 5% of the total, with much of the Black community concentrated in the Dixwell neighborhood. It was an era of Black organizing and an era of rising white supremacy, as we will discuss in a moment. It was an era when there was organizing, and again, shout out the women who were organizing at the time, like Ida B. Wells, who was crusading against lynching and led the way in women's organizing, manifest in New Haven in the formation of the Women's 20th Century Club in 1900. The Niagara movement had been founded by W.E.B. Du Bois 19 years earlier in 1905, and young New Havener George Crawford, a key founder of the Q House, was involved early on. The NAACP itself was established soon thereafter the Niagara movement in 1911, and Crawford was part of that work with Du Bois and others, serving as a national NAACP board member until 1933. The landmark Amenia Conference took place in 1916. Again, New Havener George Crawford, key founder of the Q House, was part of it all. White resistance took expression at the time in the rise of the lost cause ideology, the release of the film Birth of a Nation in 1915, white terror against Black people in East St. Louis in 1917, Chicago in 1919, and Tulsa in 1921, and many other places. And this was a time when the Ku Klux Klan had its second coming, including a rally in 1922 in Bethany, Connecticut. Say that again, a rally in 1922 in Bethany, Connecticut, next door to New Haven, with as many as 2,500 people gathered. And you see some images here of the lost cause, the first screening of Birth of a Nation in 1915. In the bottom left, a photograph from Binghamton, New York, where the Ku Klux Klan had moved its headquarters, and the parade on 1925 in our nation's capital. And you see the Connecticut delegation. So you see that this was an era of Black organizing, as well as a time of white supremacy and resistance. It was an era of organizing such as the silent protest parade on Fifth Avenue in New York City, where 10,000 people marched for voting rights, economic opportunity, and freedom, we can be confident and certain that New Haveners, including many of those like Crawford, who would go on to organize the Q House, were present at this silent protest parade just down the train line from New Haven in New York City. It was an era of flourishing Black organizing and community building, and it was an era when the literary, visual, and performing arts were a big part of that flourishing, as they would be a big part of the Dixwell Community House. Many, as you know, consider the year 1924 as the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, with its genesis being in part a dinner party at the Harlem Civic Club on March 21st, 1924. So this was the era when New Haven leaders like the Reverend Edward F. Goen of the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church and George W. Crawford formalized the idea and planning for the Dixwell Community House, coming together formally beginning in 1922, and they enlisted the support of white allies like Clarence Blakesley and Livingston W. Cleveland, and together set a goal of raising $80,000 for the building of a community center at 100 Dixwell Avenue in the heart of New Haven's Black community. And you see here some of the advertisements from early in 1923 for that fundraising campaign that would lead to the construction of the Dixwell Community House at 100 Dixwell Avenue, its first home in 1924. These building plans give you a sense of what the building had: various different recreation facilities, a gymnasium, space for women, and also space for billiards and space for dancing. And that in part caused controversy. You can see in the press of the time articles with headlines like "Clergy Hit Community House for Colored Folk," 5 pastors, and they were Black pastors, who protested the plan. That article notes, and I quote, "Regarding dancing, billiards, and pool room, we place statistics before the public and submit they show that 19 out of every 20 abandoned women date their first step downward in departure and from virtue to the dance." All kinds of opposition from various quarters, particularly because there was billiards and dancing. You see headlines: "Opposition to Community House, clergy launch another attack. Pastors denounce Community House." You saw this. Even the local alder at the time, Harry Tolliver, was opposed. But the organizers persisted, and the Dixwell Community House did open on November 30th, 1924, nearly 100 years ago from when we gather now. And it was history making from the beginning. It attracted national notice. On December 15th, 1924, just less than a month after the Q House opening, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great editor of The Crisis, national magazine of the NAACP, wrote to the Q House asking for information and a photograph to publish. The Q House was featured in The Crisis in the Easter 1925 edition, less than a year after it had been opened. This was the time when The Crisis reached tens and tens and tens of thousands of households directly and was a very influential organ throughout the country. It would be featured many more times in The Crisis, including especially the Dixwell Players, a nationally recognized theater troupe organized from our own Dixwell Q House. The Dixwell Players and the Q House were noted in The Crisis in June 1927, June 1928, January 1929, June 1929, June 1930, and February 1931, just in their first decade of existence. In fact, in 1931, W.B. Du Bois had a list, The World to Black America in 1930, that listed the best and worst things, the best things from the Black community and the worst things facing Black America. In the best things, he saluted Black art, and on the list of strengths for Black art, he included Paul Robeson, Roland Hayes, Elizabeth Prophet, Marian Anderson, and the Dixwell Players. Being in The Crisis so many times was a big deal. Du Bois, its editor, was a big deal. The magazine has as many as 100,000 subscribers at its peak, and it was a big deal. So you can appreciate that the Q House from its early days was a big deal. a big deal for Dixwell, a big deal for New Haven, and a big deal for the nation. To talk more about the Q House in its context and its peers, I'm going to turn now to Frank, to be followed by Chaz. Frank?
Thanks, Mike. So 1924 is a critical date, but it would be a little inaccurate to think that all this begins with that moment. Certainly somebody laid the foundation. So for nearly a century before, cultural organizers, Black cultural organizers, notably Black women, are founding and running community cultural organizations around the Northeast in larger free populations and communities, including Boston, Providence, and Philadelphia. In Connecticut, we had a bunch of churches that were doing that work under the guidance of women activists. In these clubs, they're doing cultural programming, they're organizing against slavery, and for the right to vote. And that work continues throughout the century. In 1896, these women's clubs, and they're proliferating, they unite as the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And the work is magnified by all the need that folks are realizing at the beginning of the 20th century. And they're, of course, still fighting for the right to vote as women. So when people say, as they did 4 years ago, that Black women have been holding up and protecting democracy, it's really been centuries, and it's not an exaggeration. In 1898, the Detroit Study Club appears. There are similar clubs around Chicago, and of course, Mike just mentioned the Women's 20th Century Club here in New Haven. And they're doing the work of protecting elders in their community, thinking about civics lessons, managing culture, and also thinking about their duty as wives and mothers and sisters. They're also pushing along art. So all the kinds of things that settlement houses are doing in cities around the Northeast, Black women's clubs have been doing for a century and are certainly doing it as we move into the early 20th century. A signal achievement for the NACW in 1917 is mounting a campaign for the preservation of Frederick Douglass's home in Washington, D.C., Cedar Hill. So as they've understood the work that women organizers did to preserve Mount Vernon, they realized that Black women across the country should act to pull in their peers and friends and loved ones to support this milestone in Black American history, the home of Frederick Douglass, and they managed to do that. So lots of organizing for national importance and for very local things. All of this organizing is happening in communities in the early 20th century. And in Connecticut, there are some push-pull factors that are changing the populations in New Haven and Hartford and Waterbury. And just a quick note on this, we like to boast that we are sort of the hometown of the Great Migration, or the home state of the Great Migration. The Urban League is working with tobacco growers in Hartford, the Connecticut River Valley, who are suddenly faced with diminishing workers with the beginning of World War I. And they try a number of workers to fill in for these men, and none of that works out. The Urban League suggests that maybe Black young people, college-bound, who have experience working in tobacco fields in the South could come up to Hartford and spend some time in the summer picking tobacco and then head back. This actually works out. They begin writing back home to friends and loved ones, and before you know it, there are more folks coming north to work in Connecticut's tobacco fields. So the Urban League follows up and sends Charles Johnson to look at cities in Connecticut with changing Black populations. First Hartford in 1921, and then Waterbury in 1923. And two really important reports are published based on that research. And what they find is that these cities, and probably other cities as well, need some sort of space for recreation. People are doing incredible cultural work in churches and small houses and places that really aren't suitable for the kind of production that's actually happening. And that really does, in different ways in these cities, push along the beginnings of the Dixwell Q House, the Pearl Street Neighborhood House, the North End Center in Hartford, and some other places. So on this slide, at the top there, we've got the Pearl Street Neighborhood Center. And this comes a bit after the Q House, but is certainly in the same generational conversation. I like to think that the Q House is special because it has this 100-year history and it's had several different incarnations, but the idea of the Q House is maintained even when the building disappears or changes. And I think that's sort of a benefit of New Haven in some ways. Other towns have had a harder time sustaining these kinds of institutions over a century. But the Pearl Street Neighbor House, because of labor needs in Waterbury, who's moving into Waterbury, and the kind of culture they're finding, is a really important agent for new migrants and for the church that helps to sponsor it. At the top there, on the other side, we've got a shot from Hartford, the North End Cultural Center, which comes a little bit later in the timeline than the Q House or Pearl Street. And it is also a community center that focuses on families and residents. And that's a distinction from this last image of the Crispus Attucks Center. This is from Greenwich. And the Attucks Center comes a bit later than the other two. It's in the 1940s, with the Second World War approaching, and a different population is being served there. The folks who are coming into Waterbury, coming into New Haven, coming into Hartford, are coming into black neighborhoods where there are families and where, as Johnson notes, there's a need for family recreation, as controversial as that might be in some cases. In Greenwich, a lot of the new workers are folks who may be living in with their employers. They're in service to big homes. They probably aren't bringing along children, and if they are creating families, they're moving to a surrounding town. There is and has been a long-standing black community in Greenwich, but those folks aren't necessarily looking to have the Crispus Attucks Center. So this center emerges in some ways from a different kind of patronage, and I think patronage is critical to the conversations of all these institutions. Who's supporting having a black cultural organization in a part of town, who's paying for it, and who is encouraging residents to participate in these institutions. And this one really is, the expectations are that they'll be different. They're not professional folks, but certainly it's not for families. And that is in some ways part of its unique character, and part of the challenge of maintaining it is that it's not a place where you're bringing your kids on weekends and doing the kind of things you do at the Q House. Maybe the next slide. So the kinds of things that happen at the Q House, and why the Q House in some ways is so unique, is because it is tied to such a thriving neighborhood. It's an incredible idea. It has support across the board in New Haven from important patrons, but also community leaders in Dixwell. And that support grows over the generations, which is really helpful. We often forget about how critical it was that the Q House is in a neighborhood with factories, and with the kind of factory support that means that there is money to spend on the kinds of things that make the house and its history so compelling and fascinating. So I pulled a couple pieces from the archive that remind us of the kinds of things that people were doing, the leisure activities that the house sponsored and that people could afford to enjoy. The racket wielders, the tennis organization that begins around this time at the Q House. This really wonderful card for a swing shift dance, which is a reminder, the swing shift. There was always somebody at work at this point. And when we think about the life of the Q House and other kinds of things that happened in sort of in Dixwell, in that neighborhood, we often forget about the fact that there was a lot of financial security in having these factories that meant there was always somebody available to go have a beer after work whenever their shift ended. There was already somebody who could stop and get a sandwich. There was always somebody who could go to a club and hear jazz. And as the work goes away, the opportunity to support those kinds of activities in the neighborhood really changes. And finally, this really great card from the Calendar Club, the hairstyle show. And we're reminded of the fact that around this state, in Waterbury, in Hartford, in New Haven, there were all these incredible opportunities to think about style and think about culture in new ways. And we don't often remember that that was all taking place. In Waterbury, there's a man named James Kefford, and he and his family have a barbershop, beauty parlor. They have little books they're producing on hairstyles, and those things end up in collections around the state as a reminder of the kind of vibrant culture that was possible in the mid-20th century because of anchors like Pearl Street and the Q House and the North End Club. So it's nice to have this chance to celebrate an institution that has held forth and maintained this kind of cultural connection to history here in New Haven. I'm going to stop here, so I could go on and turn it over to you, Chaz.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. As Michael mentioned earlier, sort of a key spirit of the work of the Q House is really coming out of community organizations, primarily spearheaded by women organizing, but also out of religious institutions. Certainly, when you're talking about work done in the Black community. And so, what we're looking at here is a photo of a fife and drum corps that was developed out of the Dixwell Congregational Church. And in the corner of the photo, in the back, there's a man with a mustache, and that is Reverend Edward Goen, who had graduated from Fisk and Oberlin and also from Yale with a graduate degree. And Reverend Goen, very much so, was someone who embodied the spirit of the institutional church. And the institutional church is sort of a one-stop shop church. At Dixwell Church at this time, you had a well baby clinic. You had the beginning of scouting for both boys and girls. You had a free milk station for mothers to be able to feed their babies, a water fountain that was serviced by anybody regardless of color. And so Reverend Goen really was looking to sort of create heaven on earth, but he understood that he had to really impact the people, children, mothers, fathers. There was a very active men's club that discussed important race issues of the day, where you had national speakers coming into town to serve as presenters to New Haven's male population around various important issues. And so really you find the roots of the work of the Q House inside of the Dixwell Congregational Church. And there were attempts to sort of open up facilities that addressed various needs in the Black community. At one time, Black people had access to the YMCA, but they could not join as full members. They did not have swimming privileges. They paid, full membership dues, but didn't have full access to the building. And that really smarted with leaders in the Black community who, didn't want any side deals. If we're to be members, we need to have full rights and privileges. And so with the Q House, there was a real opportunity to sort of provide full services to the Black community. And this was done in consort with C.W. Blakesley, who had a very interesting experience with a young Black boy who had found himself in trouble with the law, and he was doing some vandalizing. And, when the authorities were asking why he did it, he said there was no recreation and he was bored. And so, he just was making his own fun. And so it was one of the things that struck Clarence Blakesley personally. And so Reverend Goen, along with other members of the community, many of whom attended Dixwell Congregational Church, worked alongside Mr. Blakesley and other business folks to bring an institution that would service New Haven's Black population. And so many of the early Q House programs come out of the Dixwell Congregational Church. And then the next slide, you can see faces of people who contributed greatly to the development and the growth of the Q House. And certainly what needs to be understood about the Q House, that there was fundraising with big companies and New Haven sort of big business barons of the day. And that was in large part to the influence of men like Clarence Blakesley and the probate judge at the time, Judge Cleveland. But then you also had major fundraising efforts, card parties and dances that helped to provide funding for the Q House from the African American community. And so these are some faces of New Haven's Black community who helped to sustain the Q House and really sort of give the Q House the spirit that we know of today. And so in the top picture, you have George Crawford, who was a very much so respected attorney, Yale graduate, and
I believe we lost our friends.
Yeah. Right as we were going to Constance Baker Motley. Frank, do you want to give a little bit of Judge Motley's story, and we'll see if Chaz comes back?
Sure. Judge Motley, who is in some ways known to have been discovered at the Q House from a family, a Dixwell family, an immigrant family, goes to a meeting at the Q House and speaks up about things that she thinks could be better, is later invited to a meeting at Clarence Blakesley's office where he asks her why she isn't in school. And this is at a point when she's finished high school and is doing some interesting organizing work and working with a small print outfit in Dixwell, but not yet able to afford to go to college. And Blakesley offers to pay for her to go to undergrad and to law school if that's what she wants to do. And of course, she takes him up on that. He's a benefactor to several other Black young people in New Haven who couldn't have afforded to go to undergrad without his support. So a titan in a lot of ways.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Frank, for stepping in there for me. So I just want to go over again. You have George Crawford, who's a strong attorney, a leading citizen who really helped to develop the spirit of the Q House, major fundraiser, a person who was a visionary in the community and really stepped up to make sure that the opportunities he was afforded, regular New Haven citizens had the opportunity to benefit from. And I'm going to skip over the picture of Judge Motley, and I'll go back to her. But there's a really key, important figure of the Q House and of the Dixwell Congregational Church, and Mr. Charles Fletcher, who was the sexton of the Dixwell Congregational Church. And because of the close relationship between both institutions, from the day that the Q House opened, Mr. Fletcher was the custodian for the Q House, and he served in that capacity for 50 years. And then next to Mr. Fletcher, you have Dr. William Porter Norcom, who was raised in New Haven and graduated from Yale College, went on to be an outstanding physician and surgeon, and he served on the first Q House Board of Managers. You also have the very well-respected and much admired Helene Grant, who in the 40s served as a member of the Q House Board of Managers. She was really an outstanding educator and reading specialist, and was the role model for many African Americans who went into the educational profession. And the top picture in the glasses there, you have Dr. Carter Marshall, who was not only a top medical professional in the sort of Black medical network across America, he was also a very big social figure and at the center of African American community life in New Haven. You have a young picture of Constance Baker Motley, who was really formed and forged at the St. Luke's Episcopal Church in the Caribbean community here in New Haven, and certainly at the Dixwell Q House, where she was active in all sort of programs, but really made her entree, I would say, into the world as a very serious speaker and thinker. She addressed a meeting there in the 30s centered around why African Americans weren't really fully utilizing the services of the Q House. And she addressed the body, and she so impressed the gathering, including the then chair of the board, Clarence Blakesley, that he financed her college education and her law school education just from that one speech. And it was, you know, the relationship between Mr. Blakesley and obviously the brilliance of a young Constance Baker Motley that produced that fine picture of the then federal Judge Motley at the top. And then we have a picture of another outstanding educator in New Haven, and that is Winifred Virtue Dixon, who was the longtime secretary of the Q House Board of Managers. You also have Sarah Lee Fleming, a noted club woman of New Haven. She was one of the first, some say the first, Black teacher in the Brooklyn public school system. She was married to the first African-American dentist in Connecticut, Dr. Richard Fleming, and she was very active in the Women's 20th Century Club and other women's organizations. And so she is the face of much of the work that Dr. Mitchell and Michael mentioned earlier on. And you have there a woman who, it's interesting, the Q House not only was sort of a place that launched young people, but it also launched adults. That is a picture of Dr. Myra Logan Alexander, Dr. Myra Logan Alston. And she was a secretary at the Q House at one time and left to go to medical school. And she became the first African-American woman to perform open heart surgery and was a longtime physician at Harlem Hospital. She is also the great aunt of our own New Haven and national treasure, Elizabeth Alexander. And then you have a picture of Dr. Fred Smith, who was a very active New Haven citizen and physician, who was also on the board of managers. And then that is a picture there of Reverend Edward F. Goen, whose experience in the South and other parts of the country while studying, understanding the worth and sort of the crucial nature of having institutions that address the needs of the African-American community. Reverend Goen's two brothers were surgeons and physicians in Alabama who had their own offices and hospitals. So he was very interested and very understanding of the fact that the people needed a space to call their own and to thrive and to grow. And so we are seeing faces of the people who supported the Q House with their time and their talents and their influence. And the contributions of all these folks and many, many others leave us with 100 years to be able to celebrate today.
And so with that, I think we're ready to have conversations and questions, and thank Tobias for making space. We have a good living example of community collaboration in dealing with technical difficulties today, and invite questions from the audience as well about the 100 years of legacy of the Dixwell Q House in New Haven and beyond.